The Cleveland Torso murders, also known as the Kingsbury Run murders, were a series of gruesome killings that occurred in Cleveland, Ohio during the 1930s. The murders remain one of America's most infamous unsolved serial killer cases. Here's just a brief description of some of the key details in the murders. The murders took place between 1935 and 1938, with at least 12 identified victims. However, some estimates suggest that there would have been more victims to this series of crimes. The victims were predominantly drifters, vagrants, and individuals living in the fringes of society. Most were men, although there were also female victims. Due to the nature of the crimes, many of the victims' identities remain unknown. The victims were typically decapitated and dismembered, with the torsos often left in various locations around Cleveland. Some victims were also castrated. The brutality of the murders led to the nickname torso murders. The Cleveland Police Department, led by Elliot Ness, conducted an extensive investigation into the murder. Ness, famous for his efforts to combat organized crime during the Prohibition era, struggled to make progress in the case. Despite his efforts, the killer was never apprehended. Several suspects were considered throughout the investigation, including Frank Dolezal, a bricklayer with a history of mental illness, and Dr. Francis Sweeney, a physician with a possible connection to one of the victims. However, no conclusive evidence linking any suspect to the murder was ever found. The killer's modus operandi was characterized by the diminished. So I can close. Two of the most notable suspects in the Cleveland Torso murders were Frank Dolezal and Dr. Francis E. Sweeney. Here's a brief biography of each of these men. Frank Dolezal was a bricklayer who lived in the Kingsbury Run area of Cleveland during the time of the murders. He was known to have a history of mental illness and had been institutionalized at various times. Dolezal came under suspicion due to his proximity to the crime scenes and his erratic behavior. He was arrested and questioned by police, but was ultimately released due to a lack of evidence linking him to the murders. Following his release, Dolezal remained a person of interest in the case, but no conclusive evidence was ever found to implicate him. He passed away in 1949, and the speculation surrounding his involvement in the murders persisted after his passing. Dr. Francis E. Sweeney was a physician and former military surgeon who served during World War I. He was also known to have a troubled history, including struggles with alcoholism and mental health issues. Sweeney came to the attention of law enforcement due to his possible connection to one of the victims, Edward Andrassy, who was reportedly seen in Sweeney's company before his passing. Sweeney was also known to have been treated for mental health issues at St. Alexis Hospital, where another victim, Florence Polillo, worked as a nurse. Sweeney was investigated by law enforcement, including by Elliot Ness, who was the leading officer in the investigation into the Torso murders. However, despite suspicions surrounding Sweeney, no concrete evidence was ever found linking him to the crimes to this day. Sweeney's life after the investigation remains somewhat obscure. He reportedly moved to California, where he passed away in 1964. The speculation surrounding his possible involvement in the Cleveland Torso murders has persisted over the years, but his guilt has never been definitively proven. Both Frank Dolezal and Dr. Francis E. Sweeney remain enigmatic figures in the history of the Cleveland Torso murders, with their involvement in the case continuing to be subject of debate and speculation. The victims of the Cleveland Torso murders were primarily marginalized individuals, many of whom were homeless or live in transient lifestyles. Due to the nature of the crimes at the time of the past passing since the murders, not all the victims have been conclusively identified. However, here are just some of the victims known along with information available about them. Edward Andrassy. Andrassy was one of the earliest victims known of the Cleveland Torso murders. He was reportedly last seen alive in the company of Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, a suspect in the case. Andrassy's dismembered body was found in September 1935 in the Jackass Hill area of Kingsbury Run. Florence Polillo. Polillo was a known prostitute who worked in the Kingsbury Run area. She was last seen in the company of an unidentified man before her disappearance. Polillo's body was discovered in January 1936 near the location where Edward Andrassy's body was found. Frank LaSalle. LaSalle was a drifter who had a history of run ins with the law. His decapitated and mutilated body was found in August of 1937 near the Lake Erie shore. Edward Zelinsky. Zelinsky, like many of the other victims, was a homeless person and living in the Kingsbury Run area. His dismembered body was discovered in 1938 in the vicinity of Jackass Hill. Robert Robertson. Robertson, another transient individual, was known to frequent the Kingsbury Run area. His body was discovered in 1938, and like the other victims, he had been decapitated and dismembered. Rose Wallace. Wallace was one of the few female victims of the Cleveland Torso murders. She was last seen in the company of a man before her disappearance. Her body was discovered in 1938 near the location where the body of Edward Zelinsky had been found. These were just a few of the known victims of the Cleveland Torso murders. Unfortunately, due to the transient nature and often marginalized lifestyles of many of the victims, identifying information and details about their lives are limited. Many other victims remain unidentified to this day, adding to the mystery and tragedy to the case. The Cleveland Torso murders, also known as the Kingsbury Run murders, were characterized by a lack of substantial evidence, which contributed to the difficulty of solving the case. However, here is just some of the pieces of evidence and aspects of the investigation that are noteworthy. Crime scene evidence. The bodies of the victims were found in remote areas around the Kingsbury Run neighborhood of Cleveland. Many of the victims were decapitated and dismembered, and their torsos were frequently left in different locations, making it challenging to establish crime scenes. Due to the dismemberment and the lack of preservation techniques available at the time, physical evidence such as fingerprints and DNA were often scarce or compromised. Modus operandi. The consistent modus operandi of the killer involving decapitation and dismemberment suggested a distinct pattern to law enforcement. The manner in which the bodies were mutilated led some investigators to speculate that the killer might have had some anatomical knowledge or surgical skill. Witness statements. Witnesses provided various statements, but many were inconsistent or unreliable due to the transient nature of the victims and the areas where the crimes occurred. Some witnesses reported seeing victims in the company of unknown individuals before their disappearance, but these leads often led to dead ends. Suspects. Several suspects were considered during the investigation, including the above mentioned Frank Dolezal and Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, but there were no conclusive evidence linking any suspects to the murders. Despite intense scrutiny and investigation, law enforcement agents were unavailable and unable to gather enough evidence to charge any suspects with crimes. Theories and speculation. Over the years, numerous theories have been proposed to explain the identity of the killer, ranging from a lone psychopath to multiple perpetrators. Some theories suggest connections to organized crime or the possibility of a cover up by local officials. Despite extensive speculation and investigation, no definite evidence has emerged to conclusively identify the perpetrator or perpetrators of the Cleveland Torso murders. The Cleveland Torso murders generate widespread fear and panic among the public, leading to increased pressure on law enforcement to solve the case. The inability of authorities to apprehend the killer added to the sense of unease and contributed to the case notoriety. Overall, while there were various pieces of evidence and leads that were pursued during the investigation of the Cleveland Torso murders, the case remains largely unsolved, and the identity of the perpetrator or perpetrators continues to elude law enforcement and researchers. The investigation into the Cleveland Torso murders involved several law enforcement agencies and agents. Here's a brief description of some of the key details about their involvement. The Cleveland Police Department. The primary agency responsible for the investigation into the Cleveland Torso murders was the Cleveland Police Department. The department, led by Public Safety Director Elliot Ness, dedicated significant resources to the case. The investigation faced numerous challenges due to the nature of the crimes and the lack of evidence, as well as the transient lifestyle of many of the victims. Elliot Ness. Elliot Ness, famous for his effort to combat organized crime during Prohibition, served as the public safety director of Cleveland during the time of the Torso murders. Ness took a personal interest in the case and played a leading role in the investigation. Despite his efforts, Ness struggled to keep and make progress in solving the murders, as well as the case remaining unsolved during his tenure in Cleveland. Collaboration with federal agency during the due sorry to the high profile nature and severity of the crimes, there was instances of collaboration between the Cleveland Police Department and the federal agencies such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. However, the extent of the federal involvement in the investigation appears to have been limited as the case primarily fell under the jurisdiction of local law enforcement. In addition to Elliot Ness, other law enforcement personnel within the Cleveland Police Department were involved in the investigation. Detectives, forensic experts, and other officers were tirelessly to gather evidence, interview, and pursue leads. Despite their efforts, the case remains unsolved and no arrests were ever made in connection with the murders. The investigation into the Cleveland Torso murders also faced significant challenges, including the lack of forensic technologies available at the time and the difficulty of establishing suspects without solid evidence. Law enforcement also faced criticism from the public and the media for their failure to apprehend the killer and bring closure to the case. Overall, the investigation into the Cleveland Torso murders involved a dedicated effort by law enforcement agencies and personnel. But despite their best efforts, the case remains one of America's most notorious unsolved serial killer mysteries.